besieged the conspirators, until finally they took refuge at the great altar of Athena on the Acropolis. Chilon meanwhile had escaped, but the chiefs of the Naucrares promised the suppliants their lives if they would submit to trial. They agreed, yet, not having full confidence in the promise, they tied a thread to Athena's image, we are told, and holding one end of it, they went down to the tribunal. When they came near the shrine of the Furies, the cleft at the east end of the Areopagus, the thread by which the goddess gave them their protection broke, and then the archon Megacles and his supporters, or Megacles and his supporters, stoned and butchered them, permitting only a few to escape. Megacles belonged to the great Athenian family of the Alcmaeonidae, and soon all of its members were exiled. In popular belief, Megacles' sacrilege had brought the curse of impiety upon their entire clan, but more important than this, he had greatly weakened popular respect for the nobles as such. We'll skip down a bit. So we saw there a little bit more into the little Athenian uprising holding the Spartans, and now we have a little bit more about Draco, from whose name we get Draconian. Draco was commissioned with extraordinary power to codify the criminal law, and while almost nothing is known about his reforms, it is clear that they marked a great advance, particularly in the field of homicide. Now, Starr just mentioned that with one sentence, but we have quite a bit here. The Athenians were cursed with the blood feud and the acceptance of compensation for juries and homicide. But fortunately, there existed in Attica sanctuaries to which the slayer might flee while making terms with the kinsman of the slain. Draco made use of these sanctuaries as places for trial for the various classes of homicide. The nearest of kin, assisted by the phratry, were still permitted to prosecute, it is true, but henceforth the state alone had the power over the accused to punish or to acquit. This represented a great step forward in the administration of justice and the assumption by the state of its responsibility for the public welfare. Distinction was made between willful and unpremeditated murder, which before case there's no need to make such distinction. The next chapter in Athenian history records the conquest of neighboring island of Salamis and Sigium in the Troad, T-R-O-A-D. The capture of Sigium was perhaps due to the desire to protect the route by which grain was imported from the Black Sea. This would indicate then that Athens was already outgrowing the resources of Attica, which we saw a bit earlier. In the year 594 BC, the Athenians gave the archonship to Solon, and as it turned out, he was one of the great forward-looking statesmen of Greece. We know that. So closely interwoven is the fabric of a state that Solon had to give his attention to economics, the constitution, and law. He was appointed to reconcile conflicting interests and make possible security and stability for the future. He succeeded to an extraordinary degree, though his failure to deal radically with certain problems postponed the final arbitrament for a century. So remember we said that the stuff that he did lasted 250 years. But about a century after he did it, there was another major transformation. The final transformation, as Botsford and Robinson term it. On entering office, Solon proclaimed the abolition of all securities on land and person, freed those who had fallen into slavery, and forbade anyone in the future to offer his body as security for a loan. This was called the Seisachtheia, or the shaking off of burdens. Now, it's interesting that Greece had slavery, but I've heard it said before it was of an economic kind, specifically not the slavery that existed in the South in the United States of America, for example. Specifically not the slavery that exists in Egypt, where you're born into a caste and you can never leave that, and you're for all intents and purposes a slave. And the slavery that happened in the South in the United States of America was based on racism. The slavery in ancient Greece was economic. They didn't have slavery in the sense that we have it. Slavery was an economic hardship that happened to somebody under bad circumstances or something, rather than racism. Now he mentions a couple of times here the silver mines, quote, the emphasis on the silver trade. Solon, quote, revised the coinage and placed great emphasis on the silver trade. And then just a bit later, he talks about the opening of the silver mines at Laurium was another momentous step in their economy moving forward. Now, it's one thing to say that they had a silver mine and dug the silver up, but what they actually sort of did was they made silver coins and then they traded them. And people were very willing to trade all kinds of stuff for the silver coins. So, for all intents and purposes, it was a money pit full of money in the ground. They just had to know how to dig it up, know how to refine the metal, and know how to make the coinage. Anyways, we skip down a ways. The Council of 400, talk just a bit about this, was recruited from the 4 tribes, 100 from each tribe. Now remember that each tribe was configured of 3 different districts. 1 district down by the seashore, 1 district in the city itself, and 1 in the countryside. And the council, quote, prepared the agenda for the meeting of the assembly, which could only discuss matters so brought before it. This effectively controlled the deliberations of the assembly, which was now more democratic with the admission of the thetes, that is the lowest class, those who make 100 bushels a year or less on their farms. The creation of the Heliaea, H-E-L-I-A-E-A, the Heliaea courts, to which men above 30 years from all 4 property classes were eligible, really laid the foundation of democracy. The function of this court, H-E-L-I-A-E-A, was to receive appeals from the judicial decisions of the archons, to permit the people themselves, that is, to be the court of last resort, and to try the retiring magistrates for misconduct in office in case anyone accused them. And then that effectively took the last vestige of absolute power out of the hands of the aristocracy over the people. Although Solon created no democracy, his archonship opened a new chapter in the history of Athens. The people were relieved somewhat from the oppression of the nobles and freed from the fear of tyranny. The future seemed secure. The widening of the franchise to include the thetes and the establishment of the Heliaea made the government more popular. In the absence of pay for public service, however, citizens could rarely attend the assembly in large numbers, and few could sit in the Heliaea. The high property qualification of the magistrates was a strong aristocratic element. So was the old Council of the Areopagus, which was left unimpaired by Solon, and being made up of ex-archons who held office for life, could hardly be expected to show sympathy for the masses in spite of their popular election. Because they were elected for life, so then what the hell do they care if the masses don't like what they do once they get in? The net result was that the rich and nobles were to fill the offices, the commons were to have only enough power to check them and preserve their own liberties. But Solon failed greatly in 2 respects. The nobles and the retainers were practically above the law. His other failure related to land, for although he had freed the slaves, thereby alienating the Eupatrids, many men were still without land. Shepherds of the hills were especially landless. Now, I told a little fib right there. He says shepherds of the hills were especially oppressed, because they were very much so not owning land. But that doesn't mean they were oppressed. Why is a landless person oppressed? Why is a poor person oppressed? Marx. Now, I'll point out quickly. Botsford and Robinson, Starr, and what was the other one I'm using? Trevor, that's right. All 3 of these gentlemen have Marx, all 4 of them have Marx just all over. All of them written during the 20th century, and all of them took Marxist economics largely for granted. Every single argument in economics was Marxism, and a lot of it still is to this day. So that's the reason that they just sort of went, you just have to sort the Marxism out every single paragraph, you have to sort it out. Multiculturalism is that way in our time. And multiculturalism is, of course, just a morphism of Marxism. Multiculturalism is now seeing